Module 3, Federal Laws that Succeeded. I think it's important for us to look back at the 20th century and to look at federal laws that made a significant contribution to our times in the 20th century and still do. That's the point of this module. The Congress passes laws, presidents sign them, and they both hope, the president and the Congress, that they'll get credit and that a grateful electorate will return them to office. Sometimes it works just like that. Our system, remember, operates on the consent of the governed. Every single law that we'll talk about here was adopted by a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and there was consent given by the president. So those two branches and two chambers and the president all said yes. So these laws were not the product of some dictate of an autocrat. They were, in fact, the product of a democratic republic, small d, small r. For example, during World War II, the Congress passed what was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. We know it as the GI Bill of Rights. In 1924, after World War I, the Congress did a terrible thing. They didn't have much money, and there were a lot of people who had served in World War I who thought they were entitled to something. So they gave them certificates that they could redeem 21 years later. 2.6 million certificates, $3.7 billion. And these guys, by the time 1929 came around, were in the middle of the Depression. 1932, desperate, tens of thousands of them came to Washington. These are veterans who were asking for early payment for these 1945 certificates. The Congress in 1944 understood they did not want the same kind of embarrassment that happened. In the case of the bonus marchers in 1932, President Hoover drew on some of his young military officers, including MacArthur and Eisenhower and others, and they chased the guys out. They knocked down their tents and just sent them packing back home with no relief that they were seeking. That was a sad thing to which the GI Bill of Rights made a much improvement. Now, I have this Life magazine in my office. This is actually the Life magazine from the week I was born, and it features the student veteran. It tells a story all about the University of Iowa. And at the University of Iowa, they had thousands of these GIs who got help by the GI Bill to pay their college tuition. And either they were able to finish college, or to start and finish college, or to go to graduate school, that is law school, dental school, medical school, with this help from the GI's bill. At the University of Iowa, as this story is told in the magazine, the classes went from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10:30 at night. They were just rotating these guys all the way through, day in and day out. So many of the men lived on campus, especially the married guys. They had small trailers, they'd live in the quadrangle, and they all had to have jobs because the GI Bill of Rights was not excessively generous. It gave them educational benefits. Now, Topeka's own Harry Colmery was one of the guys who was an advocate and drafted the bill. He had been president of the American Legion, and he is quite highly regarded for this. I say, and so too do many other observers, that the GI Bill after World War II really had a big role in creating the middle class that we saw during this second half of the 20th century. Because remember, a lot of these guys who went to war either didn't have jobs, certainly didn't have any education beyond high school. Those who did have high school educations didn't particularly have jobs to come back to, didn't have any set of skills that were marketable. So the GI Bill was very important to them. That was a federal law that succeeded. Now in 1916, the Congress created the National Park Service. Now remember, the last state was admitted to the Union in 1912. So we were just coming to terms with all this federal land that was in the West, especially. The Congress had the foresight to set aside battlefields, mountain ranges, forests, and recreational areas so that these would not be turned into industrial parks or mined out, if you will, and have their great natural beauty destroyed. This was a remarkable law, and you would never have seen the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone or any of those if it hadn't been for the foresight that the Congress had in 1916. Now, Upton Sinclair wrote a fictional work called The Jungle. Now, he used fictional names, but the story was absolutely real, and it told the conditions and the circumstances of Chicago's packing houses, where cattle and pigs and other animals were slaughtered and turned into our food system. It was an alarming tale, and if you've never read The Jungle, you do need to read it. As a matter of fact, the Congress quickly passed the Pure Food and Drug Act because America's food supply was not previously regulated. It also, I was interested to read, drove quite a few Americans to vegetarianism for a while. In World War I, there were 2.8 million Americans who were drafted into service. Now, the United States had used conscription, the draft, back in the Civil War, but it hadn't since then. And of course, here we are, and there were a lot of people who weren't very excited about this because we were going to war, Europe's war. This was a war that was thousands of miles from us. A lot of people did not see the threat it posed to America. President Wilson and others understood that this was an important time in history where the United States needed to be on the right of freedom-seeking people. It was Wilson who said that our purpose was to make the world safe for democracy. And of course, this was just before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Now, this is Alvin York that I show here in the grainy photo in the middle, a genuine hero from Tennessee who was a conscientious objector, but who did fight and was a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. The 1942 movie with Gary Cooper came out at just the right time to add sort of the propaganda value of Alvin York's story. Here's another law that you don't think much about. But if you live in a small town anywhere in America, you benefited from the 1936 Rural Electrification Act. Remember, plants that created electricity were typically in cities. Those plants were typically owned by municipalities. And if you lived 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles outside town, nobody was going to string wire out to you because you could not afford that, and nobody was going to capitalize it. So Roosevelt and the Congress decided they were going to electrify America. And that's frankly why many places in America that we wouldn't otherwise think about settling did become decent places to live because of electricity. We still benefit as a country from this law. This is one of my very favorites. In 1946, after the war was over, every war gives the nation, America, great advances in medicine because we go under the worst circumstances and we provide intense care and save a lot of lives and rebuild men who are injured in war. Well, before 1946, there were hospitals in big cities and in small cities, but for a city the size of Atchison, for example, Atchison, we had a hospital at the time, but the Hill-Burton Act provided thousands of little towns all over America with 25-bed, 15-bed hospitals that operated as workshops for doctors. That gave the town a reason to recruit and to retain a physician, a family practice guy, a surgeon. Medicine was far less complicated technologically and pharmacologically. So if you just had a building and some nurses and a clean room for surgery, you could call it a hospital. Now, at one time in the mid-1970s, America had about 7,000 hospitals. And then shortly thereafter, because of the increasing technology and the cost of health care, about 1,500 of those hospitals went away. Here was a law that was popular at the time, but not popular with everybody. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lyndon Johnson took his reputation. Remember, he was a Southerner who had been the leader of the Senate, the majority leader of the Senate, so he knew the mood of Congress. And in this period, in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, the Congress was run by the Democrats. And the Democratic Party had two distinct arms. They were Northern city Democrats, and then there were Southern Democrats. And those Southern Democrats were really segregationist. And Johnson came from Texas, and he was in that sort of lineage. He himself was not that, he broke loose of that a long time before, but it was a struggle of his lifetime to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Remember, we had one modest law in 1957 called the Civil Rights Act of that year. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina stood on the floor of the Senate. It was the last big one-man filibuster, and talked for 24 hours to try to talk that law to death. And what he did achieve was he and the other Southern Democrats made that a very modest, inefficient, and very poor bill. 1964 set a new standard. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed. This is a ballot box my brother gave me for my birthday. It's from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And you notice there are 3 locks on there. And what I think is, I think there was 1 lock for the Democrats, 1 lock for the Republicans, and 1 lock for the county election official. So that's the way they did ballot security back in the 20s and 30s. So the Voting Rights Act outlawed discriminatory practices. It used to be in the South that you had to pay a poll tax if you were black. It used to be, if you were black in the South, you had to pass a constitutional test. If a white person walked in and were asked a question of the Constitution test, it'd be something like, who's the chief executive or who lives in the White House? And you'd say the president. If you were black, you'd walk in and they'd say, explain to me the supremacy clause. And they'd ask these obscure constitutional questions that effectively prohibited blacks from voting in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 made great progress. Not perfect, made great progress. It also identified areas in the country, principally in the South, but elsewhere also, that historically had engaged in discriminatory practices. It put them on a watch list. Their changes to laws in those states had to be approved by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights, before they could take effect. Now, about 8 years ago, the Congress got rid of most of those designations, and we'll see what happens.